Mark Zuckerberg's on Capitol Hill. The Facebook CEO summoned by the House Financial Services Committee. His first questioning before Congress since April of 2018. Concerns over the social media giant's predominance, fueled by Facebook's bid to launch a global cryptocurrency called Libra. Lack of guarantees prompting some potential co-partners in that venture, like PayPal, to pull out. But Zuckerberg is standing by Libra.
There are more than 1 billion people around the world who don't have access to a bank account, but could through mobile phones if the right system existed. And that includes more than 14 million people right here in the US. Being shut out of the financial system has real consequences for people's lives. The financial industry is stagnant, and there is no digital financial architecture to support the innovation that we need. I believe that this problem can be solved, and Libra can help.
Well, for more, we're joined by Jackson Webster, cybersecurity consultant. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you.
Mark Zuckerberg saying Facebook's going to help bring economic activity to those who are shut out of banks.
Well, it's a couple of interesting lines of argument that he uses, which are pretty reminiscent of things that he said before Congress and in public statements before. The main argument consistently for Facebook is that, you can't stop us from doing these things because Chinese companies are doing them and we have to compete with China at all costs. On another hand, we can sort of look at this more cynically and say that this is an attempt to sort of diversify enough to the point where you can say, oh, we now have competitors, you can't break us up because clearly we're not a monopoly.
Because critics worry that this Libra project would effectively mean that Facebook would be, in a way, above the scrutiny of the United States if it had its own currency effectively.
Well, there was one congressman, Sherman, I believe, a Democrat, who was basically arguing that the dominance of the dollar in the global financial system is an essential element of American national power, and that by trying to disrupt that, you're disrupting national security. There was another congresswoman, a Republican, who was speaking about the possibility of using a system like this for illicit finance. And for me, that's actually the more pertinent critique, because, you're looking at a company that has had a history of its tools being leveraged by malicious actors, of course, thinking about the election in 2016, but also in other cases, Christchurch, for example. The overall sentiment in Congress, at least that I saw from the hearing, was essentially, we've trusted you before. You have not come through. Why all of a sudden should we trust you to disrupt the financial system?
All right, before we talk about the election cycle, because we got a new one coming up, first of all, Libra, can it work at this point with all the potential partners that are starting to get spooked?
Well, a lot of people that are far more versed in cryptocurrencies than I have basically said that this is a great idea, just not for Facebook. A good critique was sort of leveled by this NYU professor, Scott Galloway, who is basically saying, why would I, trust someone who, to put a camera in my home who puts a piece of tape over his laptop camera? This is referring to Facebook Portal and the fact that Zuckerberg is, not allowing his own laptop camera to go unsurveilled. But I think that the point is really that when, brand trust is at an all-time low, at least certainly in developed democracies for Facebook, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for regulators politically to trust them to disrupt the financial system.
Now, the proceedings are going on live as we speak. We remember in April of 2018, Mark Zuckerberg appears before Congress, 10 hours of hearings, and a lot of the lawmakers looked like they didn't know what they were talking about or what this was about or what Facebook does or how it gets its revenue. Are they better prepared this time from what you've seen?
It seemed at least some Congress people were better prepared than the senators were, at least certainly. I personally did not watch the House hearings in 2018, only the Senate ones. But there were at least a few questions from a few of the initial lines of questioning that were sort of on the mark in terms of pointing out just how many problems launching a currency can potentially cause. I think that you don't necessarily need to have a whole lot of technical sophistication to say that when you've put together a consortium of, 26, 28 companies that originally formed this sort of independent Libra consortium, that when all of a sudden half of them pull out, there might be a little bit of a question of trust there.
Right. A question of trust. And as you were saying, a question of trust born from what we've learned now about the election in 2016. It's become a campaign issue in the United States. Most notably, the Democratic senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, who's running for president. She recently put out a provocative Facebook posting where it had said that Mark Zuckerberg had endorsed Donald Trump. We intentionally made a Facebook ad with false claims. She says it's false, and submitted it to the ad platform to see if it would be approved. It got approved, and quickly the ad is now running on Facebook. She said that basically Facebook has decided in favor of disinformation for profit. Mark Zuckerberg, though, says he's learned his lesson from 2016.
In 2016, we were on our back foot in terms of preventing Russia from attempting to interfere in our elections. We've spent a lot of the last few years building systems that are more sophisticated than any other company has at this point, and frankly, a lot of governments too, for defending against foreign interference.
Defending against foreign interference, and when it comes to what Elizabeth Warren is complaining about, Mark Zuckerberg says, oh, well, this is the law.
Well, okay, so there's sort of two issues that are coming into the equation here. The first one being, Warren's stunt with the Facebook ad, and of course this is referring to a Facebook policy that they have decided to keep, which is that they're not going to essentially fact-check political advertising. They're not going to go through...
Contrary to Google.
Contrary to many platforms, but yes, and the issue that a lot of particularly Democrats raised in the hearing was that, essentially you're allowing for the spread of disinformation.
Is she right when she calls it disinformation for profit? Is Facebook stand to make a lot of money?
I think the issue here is that Facebook is trying to walk a tightrope between, sort of the two powers that be in Washington, and that in order not to, they concede that at least, the sort of Warren view that potentially big tech needs to be broken up is becoming relatively popular among Democrats, and in order to avoid Republicans sort of defecting to the break Facebook up side, which a few of them have started to speak in this way, they're essentially going to pivot and address a concern relatively unsubstantiated, but nonetheless that is continually repeated by Republican politicians, that conservatives are essentially discriminated against on online platforms. Now, when it comes to actually combating disinformation itself, Zuckerberg and many other tech CEOs tend to resort to this the First Amendment argument, right? Saying that the First Amendment protects free speech and we're just not going to police speech. That's not our role. Of course, ignoring the fact that the First Amendment does not extend to private companies. The New York Times is absolutely not required to publish anything that anyone writes to it.
Right, including political ads.
Yes.
And that gets to the heart of the matter, which is back in 2016, Facebook was still denying that it was indeed a publisher, because that's what it is, right?
Well, and it still is denying that. And I think that Facebook simply starting to call itself a publisher wouldn't really be necessarily the best reaction, a priori. Mostly,
but we know it is. I mean, it's a publisher and a broadcaster.
It's a publisher and a broadcaster, but I think that the better frame to look at all this is looking at Facebook as a public utility, right? Because not everyone can push content via France 24 or any other public broadcaster. Although everyone has to use electricity and water and sewage, right? So looking at tech companies as a public utility is potentially a better way to look at ways to regulate them as a natural monopoly, if you believe that's the case. But that might not be the case if these companies end up getting broken up.
All right, yeah, because the regulation is not yet there. And as you say, breaking it up because Facebook owns also Instagram and WhatsApp, and that's the argument, right? That it's too much and that they should break them up into separate entities. Is that getting traction?
Well, the Warren campaign has built a name for itself off of this, and they're really the only campaign that's significantly engaged.
Is that popular
with
with voters, that idea?
I'm not familiar with the polling around that issue, but it has started to receive bipartisan support, even though conservatives level significantly different accusations against major tech companies. The one that they sort of share in common is that having one company with one single majority stakeholder, that being Mark Zuckerberg, controlling the three largest social media platforms in the country, far larger than Twitter, for example, is potentially problematic.
And Jackson Webster, you know that Facebook is the social medium of choice for older voters who tend to vote more for Donald Trump. The New York Times this week reporting that Trump, just like in 2016, has so far made a cannier use, or a costlier use, if you will, of Facebook, cannier than his Democratic rivals. Those are the top four. You see that the Elizabeth Warren, who's one of the front runners, she's ahead of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden in that list. They're much further down. What is your reaction when you see that Trump leads in online ads and analysts are saying he's better at micro-targeting on Facebook?
Well, I think that the Trump message politically is particularly potent on social media platforms, right? So an engagement-based platform is very well suited to highly emotional content, and Trump's arguments tend not to be policy arguments. He's actually incredibly inconsistent on policy and is actually not very conservative when it comes to many of the policies he espouses, at least in campaigns. Whereas someone like Warren, for example, was making a highly policy-related or policy-based argument, which might not play as well on social media. The same with some other candidates in the Democratic primary. So I think that you're going to use the method that's going to get you to the most possible voters, and that this would be an effective one for Trump.
Should Democrats worry when they look at that chart, or should they be saying to themselves, well, it's because we don't have a nominee yet, and then once we do, we'll get our ducks in order, and we'll know how to use Facebook as well to target voter, because that's the incredible thing about Facebook. You can go and target people almost individually with the ads.
Yeah. Democrats certainly don't have anything to prove in terms of their ability to use social media. I mean, at least they've done it in the past. The Obama team in 2008 and in 2012, absolutely destroyed on social media. I think that we are just early in the campaign cycle, and that a lot of at least two of the leading candidates are small donor driven. So Warren and Bernie have not accepted super PAC donations, and that means that they just have a smaller war chest than other candidates at different points in the cycle. I think the other issue is that the RNC is behind one single candidate and the DNC is not at the moment, and that's just because we're at a different stage in the primary process. So I think we'll really have to wait to see until we get into the primary season what's going to happen in terms of ad spend after we do the caucuses and the initial primary states on Super Tuesday.
All right, Jackson Webster, cybersecurity consultant. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.